What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan here, Max Afterburner, former F-15E Strike Eagle combat pilot, former F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and these days I fly commercial airliners for a living. I've spent my whole adult life either strapped into a fighter jet or sitting up front on a Boeing or an Airbus, and I still can't get enough of this stuff, which is why we're here today. Before we get into it, I want to say something up front. This video is about a brand new weapon system entering combat for the first time in American military history, and it's happening in the middle of a real, ongoing, and very deadly conflict between the United States and Iran. People have died on both sides of this fight, sailors, soldiers, and civilians, and I don't take that lightly for a second. My goal with this video is not to hype up violence. My goal is to break down, at a professional level, exactly what capability just got unveiled, why it matters, and what it tells us about where naval warfare is headed. So let's get into it. If you've been following the news out of the Strait of Hormuz over the last several months, you already know this has been an absolute roller coaster. Fighting broke out between the United States, Israel, and Iran back in late February. There was a ceasefire. There was a memorandum of understanding signed in mid-June between President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian that was supposed to end the blockades and guarantee safe passage through the strait for 60 days. And then, like clockwork, it started falling apart. Iran accused the U.S. of routing tanker traffic through a southern lane near Oman without approval. The U.S. accused Iran of never actually opening the strait the way it promised. By early July, Iran allegedly struck multiple commercial tankers transiting Hormuz, including vessels that reportedly killed at least one seafarer and wounded several others, and President Trump publicly declared the ceasefire over. That's a direct quote from CENTCOM's public statements and multiple outlets covering his comments in Ankara at the NATO summit, where he was reportedly frustrated that Iran hit shipping while he was standing on the world stage with other heads of state. From there, the U.S. resumed strikes, reinstated its naval blockade on Iranian ports, and Iran retaliated by hitting American-linked bases in Kuwait and Bahrain. This is not some hypothetical war game scenario. This is a live, hot conflict as of the time I'm recording this. Let me back up even further for anyone just tuning into this conflict for the first time, because context matters here. This war between the U.S. or Israel and Iran kicked off in late February of 2026. Since then, it's gone through multiple ceasefires, multiple collapses, and repeated disputes specifically centered on control of the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway. Between Iran and Oman, that roughly a fifth of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas passed through before this conflict began. At various points, Iran has attempted to close the strait entirely or route traffic through its own designated channel near Larak Island, reportedly charging tankers fees to use that route. The U.S. responded at different points with its own naval blockade of Iranian ports, intercepting vessels it said had paid into Iran's system. This back and forth over who actually controls that waterway has been the single biggest sticking point preventing a durable peace deal the entire time. The economic ripple effects have been significant too. Early in the conflict, the 32 member countries of the International Energy Agency unanimously agreed to release 400 million barrels of oil from their emergency reserves, roughly 4 days of global consumption, just to stabilize markets. Gas prices in California reportedly crossed $5 a gallon at one point, and Dubai crude briefly touched a record high above $160 a barrel before easing back down. So when you hear about a new weapon system debuting in this specific stretch of water, understand that it's landing in the middle of a conflict that has already reshaped global energy markets for months. So that's the backdrop. Now let's talk about what actually happened this past weekend, because this is the part that got my attention as a former combat pilot. On July 12th, 2026, U.S. Central Command announced it had completed a fresh wave of offensive strikes against Iran, hitting dozens of targets across multiple locations. We're talking air defense systems, coastal radar sites, missile and drone capabilities, small fast attack boats used by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, all designed to degrade Iran's ability to keep threatening commercial shipping through the strait. Nothing unusual there, unfortunately. That's been the pattern for months. But buried inside that strike package was something the Pentagon had never done before in the history of the U.S. military. For the first time ever, American forces used one-way attack sea drones, unmanned surface vessels, in actual combat. Let's watch the footage together because CENTCOM actually released video of this, and I want to walk you through what I'm seeing frame by frame, the same way I'd break down any piece of gun camera or targeting pod footage. The clip runs about 24 to 25 seconds. You see 3 small unmanned boats, individually approaching a stretch of shoreline infrastructure at what's confirmed to be Bandar Abbas Naval Base, right on the Strait of Hormuz. These things are moving in a straight, deliberate line, almost like a torpedo run, except they're skimming the surface instead of running underneath it. The footage then cuts to what looks like a first-person bow-mounted camera view, essentially the drone's own perspective, as it makes its final approach toward a raised dock. On that dock, you can make out what appears to be a small submersible sitting, exposed out of the water, apparently for maintenance. Reports suggest that submarine may be a Ghadir-class midget submarine, a small diesel-electric boat Iran has used for coastal operations and mine-laying in the Gulf. Then the video cuts back to an overhead angle, and in the final seconds, you see 3 distinct explosions and rising plumes of smoke, with the last one appearing to touch off a larger fire. CENTCOM says these 3 vessels struck a submarine and ship maintenance facility, and that the strike degraded Iran's ability to continue threatening commercial shipping in the area. Now, here's what stands out to me from a tactical standpoint. There was apparently no visible defensive response from the Iranians in that video. No small arms fire, no attempt to intercept, nothing. And that's notable because these Corsair drones, which I'll get into in a second, only travel around 35 knots, roughly 40 miles an hour. That is not fast. A rifle-caliber machine gun, frankly, could probably hit one of these things if a defender saw it coming in time and knew what it was. The fact that all 3 made it to the target and detonated without any apparent resistance tells you 2 things. 1, Iran's coastal air defense and point defense capability at that specific facility has already been substantially degraded by the preceding weeks of strikes. And 2, whoever was watching that pier that night likely had no idea what was skimming toward them until it was already too late. Because a small, low, radar-quiet surface drone doesn't look like much on a scope, especially at night, especially in a crowded harbor environment full of small boat traffic. And let's talk about the actual hardware, because I know you guys love the technical breakdown, and this is genuinely fascinating engineering. The vessel used in this strike is called the Corsair, built by a company called Saronic Technologies, headquartered out of Austin, Texas. This is a 24-foot diesel-powered autonomous surface vessel. According to the manufacturer and to Defense Innovation Unit documentation, it's rated to carry up to a 1,000-pound payload over a range of more than 1,000 nautical miles, with a top speed north of 35 knots. I want to be straight with you here because I promised you a verified, high-integrity breakdown, not hype. Those specific performance figures come from Saronic's own marketing and government catalog listings, and at least one independent defense research profile I reviewed flagged that these manufacturer-provided numbers haven't been independently validated by a third party. So take the exact range and payload figures as company reported, not gospel, even though the general characteristics line up with what multiple outlets have independently reported. What is independently and very well documented is how fast this program has moved. Saronic unveiled the Corsair back in October of 2024 as the 3rd and largest boat in their lineup at the time, following 2 smaller vessels called Spyglass and Cutlass. The U.S. Navy moved fast. Naval Sea Systems Command signed an other transaction agreement with Saronic worth roughly $392 million back in May of 2025, with an initial award of close to $197 million that same summer. The Secretary of the Navy publicly touted this program in December of 2025 as a model for how fast the Pentagon should be able to move new hardware from prototype to fleet, going from design to a production-ready boat in under a year. And investors clearly believe in it too. Saronic closed a $1.75 billion funding round in late March of 2026, led by a major venture capital firm, pushing the company's valuation up to roughly $9.25 billion, more than double where it had been just a few months earlier. They're using that capital to build out new shipyard capacity in Louisiana and Texas specifically to mass produce these attritable, expendable drone boats at a scale the traditional defense industrial base simply can't match with crewed ships. Let's talk briefly about how a boat like this actually finds its way to a target without a human physically at the wheel, because that's the part people always ask me about. Based on publicly available program documentation, vessels in this class are generally described as using a combination of adaptive path planning, meaning the onboard computer continuously replots a route around obstacles and other vessels, rather than just following a single pre-programmed line, along with passive sensors and onboard processing to identify and track potential targets, and resilient multi-channel communications, so operators can maintain command and control, even in an environment where an adversary is actively trying to jam or spoof GPS and radio signals. In plain English, think of it less like a torpedo running a single straight line and more like a small, uncrewed patrol boat that can see, think, and adjust in real time, with a human still very much in or near the decision-making loop for weapons employment. That last point matters a lot from a professional standpoint because there's a meaningful difference between a fully autonomous weapon making its own kill decisions and a remotely supervised system where a human operator is still authorizing the strike. Every credible report I found on this program describes it as the latter, and operator-supervised, one-way attack platform, not an independently thinking weapon deciding on its own who to hit. That word attritable is important, and if you're not familiar with defense terminology, let me explain it the way I'd explain it to a new pilot in the squadron. Attritable doesn't mean disposable exactly. but it means these systems are built cheap enough and produced fast enough that commanders can accept losing some of them in combat without it being a strategic catastrophe. Compare that to a manned patrol boat or a destroyer, where losing the platform means losing sailors. And that changes the entire risk calculus for a commander deciding whether to send that asset into a contested harbor. You cannot put a price tag on a human life, but from a pure operational risk standpoint, a 24-foot uncrewed boat that costs a fraction of a crewed vessel lets planners take tactical risks they simply would not take with people on board. That is the entire logic behind this whole category of weapon. And it is why you're going to see a lot more of this, not less, in the years ahead. This isn't actually the first time this exact vessel made headlines in this conflict either, and I think this next part is worth including because it shows you these systems aren't purely offensive tools, they're genuinely multi-mission. Back on June 8th, 2026, a Corsair operated by the Navy's Task Force 59, which is the Unmanned Systems Task Force based out of Bahrain, was credited with assisting in the recovery of two U.S. Army Apache helicopter aviators who had gone down in the water near the Strait of Hormuz. From what's been reported, this wasn't some purpose-built rescue mission. The boat had been fielded in the area for surveillance work roughly 10 weeks earlier. It happened to be on station. It located the downed aviators, and it moved them to a position where they could be hoisted out by helicopter. Reporting describes this as the first known instance of ISTES, military personnel being recovered at sea with the assistance of an unmanned surface vessel. A defense analyst quoted in coverage of that incident made the point that this rescue use wasn't the boat's designed purpose. It was an improvised, opportunistic use of a platform that happened to already be in the right place. I think that's actually one of the more remarkable parts of this whole story. The same class of autonomous boat that just delivered an explosive payload into an Iranian naval base 5 weeks earlier had, just a month before that, helped save the lives of 2 American aviators. That's the kind of versatility that gets war planners excited, because one hull, one production line, can be tasked for reconnaissance, for search and rescue standby, or for a strike mission depending entirely on what payload gets bolted on and what orders come down. Now let's put this into a broader historical context, because sea drones did not appear out of nowhere in this conflict. The concept exploded onto the global stage because of Ukraine. Since Russia's invasion, Ukraine has used its own naval drones, boats like the Sea Baby and the Magura series, to repeatedly strike and sink or damage Russian Black Sea Fleet vessels, despite having essentially no traditional navy of its own left to speak of. It was one of the most lopsided asymmetric success stories of that entire war, a country with almost no blue water navy using cheap, fast, explosive-laden drone boats to push the Russian fleet largely out of the western Black Sea. Military analysts have been saying for a couple of years now that it was only a matter of time before the US and other major navies adopted the same basic concept, just with more money and more sophisticated guidance systems behind it. What happened at Bandar Abbas this week is effectively the US Navy's formal combat debut of that same doctrine, adapted to the geography of the Persian Gulf. And the geography here really matters, so let me put my pilot hat on for a second and talk terrain, except this time it's water instead of mountains. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most operationally challenging pieces of water on the planet for a conventional navy to fight in. It's narrow, it's packed with small islands. Iran's coastline sits right up against the shipping lanes. You've got a constant stream of civilian tanker and cargo traffic mixed in with military assets, which creates an incredibly cluttered picture for anyone trying to identify hostile threats in real time. A destroyer or a cruiser operating in those confined waters is a big, expensive, high-value target that has to stay cautious. A small, low-profile, 40-mile-an-hour surface drone can hug the coastline, weave through island chains, blend into the background clutter of small boat traffic, and get relatively close to a target before anyone realizes what it actually is. That's precisely the kind of environment where this category of weapon provides the most value, and it's exactly why CENTCOM chose to debut it here instead of somewhere else. Let's talk about why the target set matters too, because I don't think this was a random selection. Hitting a submarine and ship maintenance facility isn't just about symbolism, it's about capability degradation. Iran's naval strategy in this conflict has heavily relied on smaller, harder-to-track assets. Fast attack craft, mine-laying capability, and midget submarines like the Ghadir class that can operate in shallow coastal water and are historically difficult for larger navies to detect and track. If that maintenance facility is where damaged or service submersibles get worked on, hitting it isn't just a one-time tactical strike. It potentially degrades Iran's ability to keep that undersea harassment capability operational over the following weeks and months. One piece I reviewed from a defense-focused outlet speculated, and I want to stress this is speculation on their part, not a confirmed fact, that the broader target list from this operation looks like it could also be laying groundwork for a more significant escalation down the road, possibly even related to past statements from President Trump about controlling strategic choke points like Karg Island, which handles a huge share of Iran's oil export capacity. I want to be very clear with you guys. That particular idea is analyst speculation. It is not something CENTCOM or the Department of Defense has confirmed, and I'm only including it because I told you I'd give you the honest range of what's being discussed, clearly labeled as unconfirmed. It's also worth noting that the US and Ukraine aren't the only parties who've been experimenting with explosive-laden drone boats in this general region. Defense reporting on this strike specifically pointed out that lethal unmanned surface vessels had already seen extensive use by both Ukrainian forces in the Black Sea and by Houthi forces operating out of Yemen against shipping in the Red Sea before this US strike ever happened. That's a genuinely important piece of context because it means the US military wasn't inventing this concept from scratch. It was formally adopting and fielding, at much greater scale and sophistication, a category of weapon that non-state actors and mid-sized militaries had already proven effective on a shoestring budget. That should tell you something about how quickly this technology has proliferated. If a group like the Houthis, operating with a fraction of the resources of a major military, can build and employ effective drone boats, that tells every navy on the planet this is now table stakes, not a futuristic luxury. I also want to be balanced here and mention that not everyone in Washington views the broader handling of this conflict favorably, separate from the technology itself. Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, for example, has publicly criticized the overall strategy behind the ceasefire agreements with Iran, arguing that the underlying diplomatic framework was poorly constructed and effectively invited continued conflict over control of the strait. I'm not going to sit here and give you my personal political opinion on that. That's not what this channel is for. But I think it's important for you to know that there is real ongoing debate in Congress about the broader strategic direction of this war, even as the tactical and technological side of it, like what we saw with this drone strike, continues to advance. A responsible breakdown gives you both layers, the hardware and tactics, and an honest acknowledgement that serious people disagree about the bigger picture. Let's zoom out one more time and talk about what this actually means for the future of naval warfare, because I think that's the real story here beyond just one strike on one night. For basically a century, naval power has been measured in tonnage, in the number of destroyers, cruisers, and carriers a nation can put to sea, and in the training and experience of the sailors crewing them. That is still true, and it's going to remain true for the foreseeable future, especially for power projection on the open ocean. But what we're watching happen in real time, first in the Black Sea with Ukraine and now in the Persian Gulf with the US Navy, is the emergence of a second layer of naval combat power that sits underneath all of that. Cheap, fast, autonomous, mass-producible platforms that can be built in the hundreds, potentially thousands, and thrown at high-value coastal and littoral targets without putting a single sailor's life directly on that specific hull. The US Navy has been investing heavily in what it calls a hybrid fleet concept for a few years now, combining traditional crewed ships with layers of unmanned surface and subsurface vessels, largely driven by the recognition that China's shipbuilding capacity has dramatically outpaced America's over the last 2 decades. This strike is, in a very real sense, the first combat proof of concept for that entire strategic bet. And you can bet defense planners in Washington and in Beijing are both studying this footage extremely closely. I also want to talk for a minute about the human side of the equation for the people who actually build and operate these systems, because I think it's worth pointing out. The Navy officer who commented publicly on this milestone, a CENTCOM spokesman, made the point that U.S. forces deployed to the Middle East have rolled out several new capabilities throughout this conflict, and that quickly getting new tools into the hands of warfighters increases combat effectiveness, which the command says remains a continuing priority for them. I think that's a fair and honest way to characterize it. This isn't about some flashy new toy for its own sake. Every capability like this exists because someone in uniform sat down and asked, how do we accomplish this mission while reducing the risk to our own people? That's genuinely the design philosophy behind unmanned systems across every branch. Whether we're talking about a Reaper drone flying Overwatch, an EOD robot defusing a roadside bomb, or a 24-foot boat running headlong into a defended harbor so a destroyer crew doesn't have to. Now, let me put my safety-focused hat back on for a second, because that's a big part of what this channel is about. I know some of you watching this are going to see headlines using words like huge and never saw it coming, and immediately assume this represents some massive war-altering escalation. I want to give you a grounded, professional read on that. This was a significant technological milestone, no question. The first combat use of an armed sea drone by the US military is genuinely historic. But strategically, in the context of a conflict that has already seen months of strikes, a naval blockade, missile exchanges, and multiple rounds of failed diplomacy, This is best understood as an evolution in tools, not a sudden shift in the overall trajectory of the fight. The U.S. was already conducting strikes against these categories of targets with manned aircraft and cruise missiles. What changed is that one specific strike package used an unmanned boat instead of, or in addition to, those traditional platforms. I'd encourage everybody watching to get their information from credible primary sources on this, official CENTCOM releases, established wire services, and defense trade publications, rather than from accounts that are mixing real defense reporting in with unrelated, sensationalized content just to farm clicks. This is a serious ongoing conflict with real casualties on multiple sides, and it deserves to be covered with accuracy, not hype. Let me also just take a second to lay out clearly what we know for certain versus what's still uncertain, because that's the responsible way to close out a breakdown like this. Confirmed from CENTCOM's own statements and multiple independently reporting outlets. 3 Saronic Corsair unmanned surface vessels struck a submarine and ship maintenance facility at Bandar Abbas Naval Base on the night of July 12th into the 13th. This was the first combat employment of sea drones by U.S. forces, and it was part of a larger strike package that also hit air defense systems, coastal radar, missile and drone infrastructure, and small boats using conventional aircraft, naval vessels, and one-way aerial drones as well. Also confirmed, the broader collapse of the ceasefire and memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Iran in early July, following alleged Iranian strikes on commercial tankers in the Strait. Less certain, and worth watching as this develops, the exact battle damage assessment from this specific strike, meaning how much that facility and any submarine present were actually degraded, since CENTCOM's video doesn't give us enough to independently verify the extent of destruction. Also uncertain where this specific operational thread goes next, whether we see expanded use of these sea drones, and whether broader analyst speculation about targeting patterns tied to future operations bears out. I'll be honest with you, nobody outside of the Pentagon's actual planning cells knows that with certainty right now, and anybody telling you they do with total confidence is probably guessing. There's also a cost dimension to this that I think gets underappreciated outside of defense circles. A single modern guided missile destroyer runs well over $2 billion to build, takes years to construct, and requires a crew of roughly 300 sailors to operate. A 24-foot autonomous vessel like the Corsair costs a tiny fraction of that, can reportedly be produced at a much faster tempo through the kind of dedicated shipyard capacity Saronic is now building out, and requires 0 sailors physically aboard during a strike mission. That math doesn't mean crewed ships are going away. They absolutely are not. A destroyer brings capabilities in air defense, sustained presence, and firepower that a small drone boat simply cannot replicate. But it does mean naval planners now have an entirely new, much cheaper category of tool they can throw at high-risk, high-value coastal targets without gambling with a full crew's worth of American lives every time. From a purely professional standpoint, having flown combat missions myself where risk to the air crew was always the #1 factor shaping how a mission got planned, I understand exactly why commanders find that trade-off so attractive. One more thing I want to flag clearly as unverified. I've seen some channels and newsletters covering this same story throw around claims about strikes hitting a specific number of Iranian cities in a single night, or framing this as some kind of coordinated multi-domain blitz with a neat cinematic narrative attached. I was not able to independently verify those specific city count figures against CENTCOM's own statements or against the major wire services I reviewed for this video, so I'm leaving them out entirely rather than repeating a number I can't stand behind. That's the standard I try to hold every video on this channel to, and it's especially important on a story this serious. So here's my bottom line as a former fighter pilot looking at this from a professional standpoint. What we watched in that CENTCOM footage is a real, validated, historic first for American naval warfare. It's the product of a defense company that went from a startup pitch to a $9 billion valuation and a live combat strike in under 2 years, which honestly is a pace of innovation that would have been unthinkable in the defense industry a decade ago. It reflects lessons the U.S. clearly absorbed from watching Ukraine reshape naval combat against a much larger opponent using exactly this kind of asymmetric, low-cost, high-volume approach. And it's happening inside one of the most strategically important and geographically constrained waterways on Earth, where roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas has historically transited before this conflict disrupted the flow. Whatever you think about the broader politics of this conflict, and I know opinions on that run hot in every direction, the engineering and tactical story here is worth understanding on its own merits, because this is very likely the first chapter of a much bigger shift in how naval forces are going to fight in contested, confined waters for the next several decades. All right, everybody, that's officially my full breakdown. If you want to go deeper on any of this, I'd strongly encourage you to go read the original CENTCOM release yourself, along with coverage from established defense trade outlets like Military Times, Naval News, and USNI News, all of whom did excellent sourced reporting on this that I leaned on heavily to put this video together responsibly. Do not take breakdown videos, including mine, as your only source on an active military conflict. Go verify things yourself, cross-check multiple outlets, and be skeptical of any channel that gives you certainty on details that are still genuinely unconfirmed. Now, 2 quick things before I let you go. First, if this kind of grounded, no-hype military technology breakdown is what you come to this channel for, do me a favor and hit subscribe with notifications turned on, because I've got more of these coming as this conflict develops, and I want you seeing them the moment they drop instead of missing them in your feed. Second, I read every single comment on these videos, so drop a comment below and tell me what you want broken down next, whether that's more on this Iran conflict, another aircraft platform, or something totally different. Because a huge chunk of my video ideas come directly from you guys, and I genuinely do read through the suggestions before planning out the next few uploads on this channel. All right, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe out there. I appreciate every one of you for sticking around through this whole breakdown, and I'll see you in the next video. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.